we know that the civil rights movement was all about gaining equality, gaining access. But equity is more about, okay, if we give everybody the same, we're still going to have uneven outcomes. And so what equity is all about is going back and saying, okay, what does this particular group need in order to move forward?
Welcome to Corwin's Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast with hosts Peter DeWitt and Michael Nelson. This podcast is from education leaders for education leaders. Every week, Peter, Mike, and our guests get together to share ideas, put research into practice, and ensure that every student is learning not by chance, but by design.
Dr. Latish Reed, welcome to Corwin's Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited for today's conversation.
We have so much we want to get into, especially in your work around equity, which is going to be mind-blowing for sure for this conversation, especially during 2025. But I want to know, so you were a school leader in Milwaukee. Can you give us a little bit of your background?
Sure. So I was a school teacher. I taught middle school. So I'm a special educator. When you do middle school, you are a special teacher. And so I did sixth, seventh, and eighth grade. I also was a school administrator, assistant principal. I had one of the best principals ever, Mr. Anderson, my leader and mentor. And then I decided to take a little veer off and I went back to school full time at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. And I got my PhD in educational leadership and policy analysis. Then I spent some time in the professorate, and then I became the Milwaukee Public Schools' first equity administrator, and I was the equity specialist for the entire district.
Wow. Can I ask you a follow-up question on that? So, first of all, congratulations on all of it. What was it like to be the first equity administrator in the schools in Milwaukee?
So the first meant that you really had to do a lot of professional learning around what equity is.
Mm,
Because often people, and they still confuse equity with equality. And
mm,
so, we know that the civil rights movement was all about gaining equality, gaining access. But equity is more about, okay, if we give everybody the same, we're still going to have uneven outcomes. And so, what equity is all about is going back and saying, okay, what does this particular group need in order to move forward or to make that progress and have those kinds of outcomes that we're seeking? And so, we did a lot of professional learning about the differences. And then also, just really getting people to understand that within their own spheres of influence, that's where the change happens. Right
mm.
now, equity is this big pie in the sky thing that we keep talking about when it's really about understanding what it is that you control, what you influence, and then understanding how to make those tweaks and changes that will result in more equitable outcomes for everyone.
What I wish, Peter, I wish that if you're listening to this in the car, that you continue to listen to it, but then you take time to actually watch it because, Dr. Reed, as you talk, you are so expressive in your nonverbals and your hand gestures that I'm making such more additional meaning by how you represent that. And, what I hear you saying is, boy, you had to build a lot of shared understanding, that base and knowledge about what equity is, and congratulations to you on leading that. And you succinctly, in about boy maybe 60 seconds, described that. But your journey to this book that's going to come out in April, "The Complexities of Equity," navigating shades of gray in schools and organizations, was a journey for you. And it was not something that you did in 6 months. It was a journey over years and years. And so even though you succinctly described things in 60 seconds just a moment ago, This book must be so important to you that you took years to develop this journey. Could you describe for our leaders listening about this journey and why not 6 months versus several years?
So I started writing the book in 2017 in
Wow.
my second year of being the equity specialist.
Okay.
And the reason why I thought about all of my training. So I went to the top school in the nation, the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Shout out to the ELPA department.
Go
Shameless plug.
Badgers. Are they Badgers?
Go,
No
go
worries.
Badgers. Yes.
Yeah,
But
see, okay.
I
Peter,
Oh
Badgers.
my. Oh,
we're not all able, okay? But what I would like to say though, literally, I had some of the best professors in the world. Colleen Capper was my dissertation chair. Rich Halverson, just all that team was phenomenal in really teaching us what schools should look like. They trained us to research and read the literature and do all those things. But then when you get into the space and you start saying these things, it becomes problematic because what equity really is about is asking people to do something different than what they've been doing. So while I was doing the work, I was like, I began to feel like the equity gnat because they knew when I was in the room, I was going to ask a question and that would change the conversation a bit. And so I realized that, there were different levels of people that were enacting equity. There was this very performative, and I like to call that light gray. We like to put that term into our missions and our visions, and we like to say that, but then it is more difficult to do it. And so there is a lot of performativeness around it. There is a lot of, oh, we'll get a committee to take a look at that. And it's take a look at something we already know, but now we're 6 months out from actually being able to do something. And now it's the new school year, right? So then I also knew that there were people that were against the changes and they were actively pushing back the
Mm,
progress that was being made. Or sometimes people would give misinformation to get people disoriented and confused. And so I call that like the white phase. And again, I'm not talking about race
mhm.
because I know people are really funny about, well, why is the white phase the worst phase? No, 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 it's the color. There are no gray people. So remember that. So shades of gray, we're talking about the color spectrum. But again, going back to that white phase, there are people that are actively pushing against equity. Then I met a lot of people that understood I'm in an organization that has some boundaries, but I'm going to use my spheres of influence and who I am, the identity that I bring to this work, and
mhm.
I'm going to use that to make progress. And so I call that the dark gray phase. And honestly, that's probably a lot where many people would want to be because, again, there is a tension. You're in an organization. There are lots of people that have different ideas about what justice is, what equity is, and so you're really navigating, negotiating what that is to have the maximum outcome. Then there is the black phase, which is not as easily defined. And shout out to Lucas. Lucas made me rewrite that chapter. We really had to make sure that we understood that there is this theoretical imagination about justice. And we're always going to fight for justice. No matter what comes our way, there's always going to be some group of people fighting for the people that are marginalized, the less fortunate. Um, when I think about this work, the term DEI is, that's the demonized word now. I don't care. Call it civil rights. There was a civil rights movement where people did what they needed to do on behalf of others who were not able to use their voice. If you want to talk about women's suffrage. Women marched in the streets because they were not given the right to vote. And they did it until they had the right to vote. If we want to talk about abolition work, there were people, not just Black slaves, but white people who took up the mantle because they didn't believe in slavery. And so it does not matter what happens, what comes our way, there will always be someone somewhere that's going to do the right thing on behalf of people. And so that complexity is what I was grappling with in the role, and this framework came to me as to how to navigate, negotiate it, and really think about what individuals can do to move forward.
So I first thank you because I love the hope. I don't always feel so hopeful. I have to be honest with you. I'm just going to be very raw and honest. You know, as at the time we're recording this in February, late to mid February of 2025, there are announcements about being DEI being stripped, you know, and everything that's happening there. And you were talking about equity being on a mission or vision. Is equity at risk? um, with the conversations that are happening. You're spot on when you're talking about the complexities of equity. What I'm worried about is people are so afraid to actually talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion within schools. And not only because of the political side, that's a huge, huge part of it, but also a self-efficacy side. They don't feel efficacious enough. They don't feel confident enough to talk about this. And I feel like your book gives the hope of being able to find ways to do that. So I guess my question is, because I'm looking for some hope too, because you're right, we always want to do the right thing. We want to push forward. That's why we want to have these conversations. What can leaders do in this current political environment, especially, and I'm going to say it, in schools where there's a majority of white students who actually need exposure to diversity more than anybody, I think. What are leaders, what can leaders do to keep moving forward where diversity, equity, and inclusion, or specifically equity, is concerned in this time?
So there are a couple of things. In the book, I have a framework called the ICE T. So your ICE T is your identity, understanding what that means. Also, um, the experiences or the context that you're working in, right? So if it's schools or companies, because this work really spans all industries. It really does, like the concepts do. Um, and then the experiences that you've had. So people, to your point, now, if you've been talking about diversity or equity, or you've been, really sharing knowledge and treating students, no matter, what their gender identity is, you've been treating children fairly, doing all of those things. And now it's this rolling back of the work. So that's the context. And, people might get their hands slapped about doing what's right for children, as other people outside of the organization are advocating. So we know that. And then the T in the ICE framework is about the timing. And oh my goodness, are we at a time, right? And so thinking about your ICE, reflecting on the things that you can do, it's reflecting on the things that you're willing to do. See, because when we think about people like John Lewis, everyone loves the quote, get in good trouble, necessary trouble, and help redeem the soul of America. That's John Lewis's quote. We're at a time where people may need to get into some good trouble.
Mhm.
I don't know what that means. And what I always think about is, there are lots of references to Dr. King in this book, and not the typical references about Dr. King, but again, we kind of deify him, in his death, but he wasn't a popular dude when he was living. There were people that followed him, but he caused a lot of trouble. People didn't want him in their community boycotting or marching because that meant trouble for them.
Mhm.
But at this point, we are at a time where people will have to decide, where do I stand? What am I willing to risk? Because there were people that risked their lives in the past. I just had a conversation with my sister before we got on, and we were talking about Jasmine Crockett. And she's like, "Oh my goodness, I just want her to be okay. I want her to be, because she's speaking out so fiercely against what's happening. And we do know what happens to people that speak out. I told her, I said, You don't need to worry about her because she understands the risk that she's taking. So I'm in a good, I just wish her all the best because, again, very few people are speaking out in these times. I don't know all of the political ramifications, but again, we have to find our voice in this. For
Mhm.
school leaders, we are sworn to take care of children, and we need to do that.
Mhm.
So I'm not sure what it means for each person individually because you have to think about your own iced tea, your own identity, your own context, and the experiences within that space. But what is it that you can do to protect children and to make sure that we have the outcomes that we seek? Because if all of a sudden, we already have gaps. So if we just refuse to pay attention to the gaps because we're told don't pay attention to the gaps, then by the end of this, we're going to be even further behind.
Mhm.
I think that's, beautifully stated. And back to toward the beginning, you used a couple times the sphere of influence. And as a father of a son who's a middle school principal, and really talking through some of these leadership pieces with him. What does he have control over? What language does he use in the newsletters that he writes? When he does a staff meeting, how does he empower his staff to continue to lead and take care of the mission, like you talked about the students, and the care in which you take care of those students and their families during this time? The exquisiteness in the language is also a huge key. And so I think the timing of your book actually couldn't be better.
Mhm.
It sounds like Lewis, if I heard that correctly, was was a huge nudge to make sure that the chapter, the on Black, really was framed in a way for educators to take and lead. And I agree with you that this book, I'm sure, is well beyond educators and who should be reading it. So kudos to you on that piece. As you were writing it over the course from 2017 through 2024, and I know it's in process now, so in 2025 it'll be released. Do you have some stories for our leaders who are listening of things that you thought this school district or this building, this situation, those are good examples that should be shared as a way to help build understanding for moving forward.
Mhm. So the book I like the way it came together because there are my personal reflections on popular things that happened in society. Um, Then there are also real examples of leaders that I worked with. And then there are four different vignettes at the end of each of the shades chapter. So there are lots of stories and things that people can, reflect upon. But in the dark gray chapter, the vignette is based on someone that I worked with. And the person I changed the person's identity and everything, but there was a department that this particular person worked in. And when I was in the district doing the work, they would come to me and they were always like, "Hey, Dr. Reed, can we, chat? I have all these things, and I work with the city at large, and so I really would like, your take on how we could be more equitable in what we're doing." And the person had me come in, do professional development. They sat in the meetings. Like, what leader, director sits in the meeting about professional development? They usually say, yes, the leaders go, you get it, tell me what. No, the person sat in every meeting, had input in how we facilitated with the staff. We had some ups and downs with it because when we brought some of these concepts to the staff, people were uncomfortable. And so we had to go back and figure out, now, how do we take care of that? What norms can we make sure are in place? But at the end of the day, they held the standard that we will do better. As leaders, what are the gaps and what are things that we can actually do? Now, we may not be able to do everything, but we want to do better than we did last year and the year before. And so that was a real life experience. I worked with our social workers, I worked with our school counselors, the school psychologists, a lot of people that I worked with, they took this on, they took the mantle and they looked within their context and they decided what are the things that we can start discussing with our staff to make sure that there are equitable outcomes. And so that just brings me back to what I was saying at the beginning. Equity, the big pie in the sky, it's not as complicated as people are making it seem, and it's certainly not the political football that it has become.
One of the things that you were talking about earlier with outcomes, and I, I do agree that I think it's data that we have to be able to look at too. Mike and I are doing a lot of work with school leadership teams where we use multiple measures from Bernhardt's data, and we're really getting into who's missing from the story, who's missing from honors classes. I moderate a show for Education Week called A Seat at the Table, and we've talked about you know what conversations are schools having about the students who are missing from the dialogue. And one of the reasons why I said schools that have a majority of white students in rural areas need to have these conversations too, because I went from teaching for 11 years in high poverty city schools to being a principal in a rural suburban school, and those kids needed exposure to equity as much as any other kid, because they're the ones who are going to make assumptions, right? There are going to be a lot of assumptions that are made. But I think going back to the data piece and talking about who's missing from the dialogue is a really important piece of this puzzle as well. I guess one of the questions that I want to ask too is just, what are the first steps? Like, what would be, because let me back up a little bit more. People also make an assumption that there are states within the United States that are heavily conservative or whatever, and they don't want to have these kind of discussions. And in some cases, the governor is like banning these conversations. But what I find when I'm working in some of these states is when the room is closed and the doors are closed, people want to have these conversations. And that's why I agree with Michael that your book is coming out at an incredibly important time, because people want to have these discussions. They don't want, they're not, they're concerned about politics, but they also want to say, like, how do we move forward? So I really liked your idea about what are the words we're using, right? If this word is banned, then what's another word we can use to get the same thing? So I guess besides those, which I think are really great examples of what people can do, what are some other things that you see school leaders doing during this time? Because just because you're finishing up the book doesn't mean you've stopped being in schools doing this work. So during this time, what are some really great examples of what you see presently right now where people are moving forward with this conversation and doing the work?
So I'm actually working with a school now, within the context of a district that still has a DEI person.
Mhm.
And so I was able to connect with a principal. And I think right now, I'll be honest, everyone is still sort of trying to figure out what does all of this mean at this time. But again, if you are focused on children, that's at the front of your mind.
Mm.
And this particular leader, I can give you an example. She shared with her leadership team that they had some reflection feedback from students about their experience. And she had a very sharp decline in her Latino students. So, I feel safe. I feel valued. I feel seen at school. So there was this sharp decline during kind of the time of the, political campaigning and all that kind of stuff. And so what's happening on the outside trickles on the inside.
Mhm.
We have other districts that, before everything happened, grappling with, certain terminologies that students are using in school and, all of that. I think people are wanting to do something, so you call someone like me to say, "How do we have these conversations?" Um, but I do think that people are still trying to figure it out. At the end of the day, if we put students in the center, George Theo Harris is one of my mentors, and in his one of his frameworks, he just has student achievement in the middle of the framework. So then you've got professional to learning, building the capacity, community outreach, all this other stuff. But as the leader, if you keep student achievement in the center, you will figure out how to get people to rally around that. Now, one of the things that I always say um, during this time, people have to really figure out their moral compass, right?
Mhm.
Because certain things are being taken away. We're not allowed to, so two genders, and we're just not having the conversation about trans kids.
Mhm.
There are still trans kids in the school.
Yeah.
So I mean, regardless, you can say we're not talking about it, but they're still there. And so we have to figure out how to still address the needs of our students that show up.
Mhm.
If we know but that's the other thing. It's so let's say, because okay, Peter talked about white rural schools. White rural schools are not, homogeneous.
Right.
There are lots of things going on where teachers need to figure out how to get various students to move.
Mhm.
So what's different in the context where there is a diverse setting?
Mhm.
You know, preparing rural white students to go to the university where there will be diversity. You need to share that there are different people in the world, and
Yeah.
they've had different experiences and backgrounds. And no, it's not just tuning into the Super Bowl halftime, right?
Right.
So we have to make sure that we are doing what George says we need to do, and that's keep student achievement in the center. And that is looking at the data and then the things that will challenge us to do what we need to do to meet all students' needs.
I think what you just said in terms of you used a phrase that I think you would get 100% consensus on addressing the needs of all students.
Mhm.
The example that you gave in terms of how what Peter talked about in terms of majority white and get preparing them to go to a university that's diverse, you have to address the needs of those students. That would put people to a pause, which I think is not a bad thing. And I think that was a beautiful example, Dr. Reed, of that. We're going to be closing our time together, and I have a final question, Peter. I don't know if you do, but I would love as we put our clothes together. You mentioned before we hit the record button how incredibly proud your family is of you and the work that you've done and having your PhD. And that just really warmed my heart. And so you spent 7 years crafting, reflecting, jotting notes, hearing stories, putting stories in, taking stories out of this life's project for you that was going to be come out in April 20 in just a couple months. And I want to celebrate with you. But what I would love our listeners to know, who who was your North Star during those 7 times? Who was the person that stirred in your heart and your head as you took 7 years to put this together?
My son, I have a son. His name is Zion. He is a freshman at Rice University. He is so smart. He is so brilliant. But as I became a mother a little later in life. And so I had been a school teacher, I had been an administrator, but when I had this child, I was like, "Oh my God, we have to get school right for real." Because my son is gonna be there. But he's such a gentle soul, thoughtful, intelligent, but he is a Black male child. And so I was always like, "Oh my goodness." So everything that I might understand or hear stories or see data about, I wanna make sure that my son can navigate these systems, and I was the fierce mama bear about that, but he was really, the inspiration for the book. I come from a very strong family. I write about, my mother and my father in the book. They always taught me to stand up for right. Um, I've always done that. That's the way I was raised, and that's just who I am. So here we are.
Well, I
That is
love that you chose your son. And will you just will you tell me if he were here right now, what's the one thing that he would want you to hear?
He would hear, and he hears it all the time, "I'm so proud of you. I am so proud of you. You have done amazing things." My son was the second Black male valedictorian at his IB high school here in Milwaukee. And the amount of focus, tenacity that he had to do that was just outstanding. He's much better than me, and I just want the best for him, and he knows that. So
Well, thanks for putting the passion of your son into this book and sharing it with the rest of us. Peter?
Dr. Latish Reed, it's been an honor to talk to you. Thank you for being on Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast. The book is called The Complexities of Equity: Navigating Shades of Gray in Schools and Organizations. And just as a final, Latish, where can people find you?
well, I have a website. It's
There you go.
readlead.com, readlead.com. So reedlead.com. And you can email me at latishreed@readlead.com.
Thank you so much. Latish, congratulations on the book.
Thank you all for having me. This has been a really exciting conversation, and I hope you all continue your work together because you're a good duo.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Michael, what are your thoughts? Latish Reed was really great to talk to. Such an important topic. I loved her shared. She developed for us a shared understanding about equity pretty quick and pretty easy. You're always looking for that elevator speech. She had a good elevator speech about equity.
She did. She captured it in a minute. And I was really looking to see if she could because in preparing for this podcast I'd read a lot about her, and I knew that it was a journey to write this book that's going to come out in April of 2025. And I wanted to hear about it, and but she like nailed this 45-second 60-second soundbite about it. And you could tell that there's been a lot of thought and reflection and writing and rewriting during those 7 years, Peter.
Yeah. And I wish I wish that this wasn't such a hot button subject to talk about. I wish we were in a place where we could just talk about how to go deeper with this work without there being some sort of political piece to go along with it. But with that being said, that is our reality right now. And I like the spaces she provided for people to engage in these conversations in different ways. And I think the book is coming out at a very important time.
I think you asked a brilliant question, and I'm so grateful. It's just really what makes you really good as a facilitator, Peter, is the ability to ask questions that could draw emotions in what's occurring right now in the world. Um, and it needed to be asked. I mean, we could have done this podcast interview and just strictly talked about the book and not put it in the context of what's happening in the, as you said, we're in mid to late February as we're recording this, and there's a lot that's happened in the last month in our country, and it's has individuals having a lot of feelings around the topic of equity and DEI in particular. Your question was exquisite. Her response in moving forward and was beautifully stated. I just am thankful that that was embedded in this podcast.
Yeah, I feel like, she was talking about responsibility, right? And we have a responsibility in the work that we're doing, um, to be able to have these conversations. Let's be honest. You and I just did a few days of work in New Brunswick, Fredericton, Canada, with a group that we love, that we've been able to work with for 15 months. And we're walking in there in the political realm of what's been said about Canada. And like, these are things we need to we need to talk about, because to not talk about them, I think, is just wrong. So we need to be able to have these conversations. And I guess what I'm always looking for are ways to have the conversations in what you say an eloquent way, but it's because who you and I are is all about you were starting to write a blog about you were just born with empathy. You can't you want people to do well. I want people to do well. I want people to have fair shots at life, and to not have these conversations would be wrong. And I think there are ways that we can have these conversations in ways that will provide a deeper understanding, regardless of who's telling us not to have these conversations, because the reality is people still want to have these conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And by not having them, people fill in the space with things that maybe aren't true.
Yeah.
And so, being able to have that kind of conversation about who you are as we come into, do work in Canada. Who are Peter and Michael coming into Canada?
Yeah.
Um, those are really good conversations to have. And the dad in me loved that she talked about her son, and that
Yeah.
that was who was in her head and heart as she spent the 7 years moving through the process of having this book come together, um, and the pride in which she showed for him, and it showed the humanness
Mhm.
of what I believe all parents really feel
Yeah.
about their children.
Well, and you and Britt have not only two wonderful kids, um, a son and a daughter, but you have four grandchildren. You want the world to be a better place for them. And maybe to some that sounds cliche, but I think for us, that's exactly what we're trying to do. So, and you're right. When the one thing you just said really struck me. If we don't have these conversations, people, and we don't start off like we did when we were in Canada, people are going to fill the space with something else. And we want to make sure to give them the right information. So, Michael, I admire you, and I'm just honored to be able to do this Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast with you. This interview obviously was a profound one for both of us. So, thanks to Dr. Latish Reed for being on the show.
I can't wait for her book.
Yeah. All right, everyone. If you, we're always looking for likes, isn't everybody in 2025? But we're always looking for feedback too. So if you have any feedback about our podcast, please let us know. And thank you again. And Michael, I'll see you soon.
See you soon.